I did not learn that we were doomed through gunfire or alarms or the screaming descent of enemy craft. There was no heroic warning, no dramatic failure. I learned it from a slate that refused to recognize me as alive. The quartermaster's office was a narrow chamber sunk into the lower levels of the barracks block, its walls sweating with condensation from pipes that rattled like bones whenever the generators surged. The air always smelled of old ink, machine oil, and damp paper. Sacred scents, we were taught, the perfume of order. I had stood in that line 1,000 times before, boots on the same cracked tiles, ration stamp clenched between two fingers already calloused from labor. It was routine, ritual, comforting in its way. When my turn came, the quartermaster did not look at my face. He never did. His eyes were fixed on the slate, on the cascading columns of numbers and sigils that defined our worth. I slid my ration stamp across the counter. It made a dull sound, too loud in the quiet room. He pressed it to the reader. Nothing happened. He frowned, not at me, but at the slate. He tried again, harder this time, as if pressure might convince the machine to care. The reader chimed once, low and unhappy, then flashed a dull red sigil I had only ever seen from a distance. Unit designation, he asked. I recited it automatically. The words tasted dry in my mouth. We all knew our designations better than our own names. Names were for childhood, and childhood had been burned out of us long ago. The quartermaster's fingers moved faster now, tapping commands, pulling up deeper layers of the ledger. The room seemed to grow colder as he scrolled. I felt it through my boots, the chill creeping up from the floor as if the hive itself were recoiling. He cleared his throat. "You are not listed," that was all he said. At first, I thought it was a test. The Imperium loved tests, small, cruel surprises meant to expose weakness or heresy. I stood straighter, repeated the designation, added the block number, the duty cycle, the last confirmed delivery date. I gave him everything I had been taught to give. The slate remained red. Behind me the line shifted. Boots scraped. Someone coughed, a wet, desperate sound that lingered too long in the air. Hunger was already common, even then, but we had learned to ignore it, to file it away as background noise. The quartermaster finally looked at me. His eyes were pale and tired, rimmed with red. There was no malice in them. Worse, there was indifference. "Step aside," he said. "I will file a discrepancy." A discrepancy. That word carried more weight than any curse. I was escorted, not dragged, not beaten, just firmly guided, out of the ration hall and back into the barracks. Orders followed me like a shadow. No ration issued, no supplemental allotment, await clarification. Continue duties as scheduled. The clarification never came. Within a day, the effects spread. The heating cycles in our barracks shortened, then stopped altogether. The vents exhaled only cold, recycled air that smelled faintly of metal and rot. The lumen strips dimmed, their light flickering like dying candles. Power allocations, we were told over the crackling vox, had been temporarily rerouted to higher, priority sectors. We were advised to conserve. Not just food, everything. Conserve heat, the notice said. Conserve movement. Conserve breath. That line stayed with me. Conserve breath. As if even the air we drew into our lungs was a resource we no longer deserved. At night, I lay on my bunk wrapped in a threadbare blanket that smelled of old sweat and antiseptic, listening to the building settled. The hive was never silent, but its sounds changed. Machines slowed. Distant manufacturum rhythms faltered, their steady percussion breaking into uneven, arrhythmic thuds. Somewhere far above, something massive groaned and went still. I told myself it was temporary. Everything in the Imperium was vast beyond comprehension. Entire generations lived and died between updates of a single ledger. Clerical errors happened, misfiled designations, a missing stamp, a data slate corrupted by dust or age. It was unthinkable that we had been forgotten, not erased, not condemned, just overlooked. Faith demanded patience. That was drilled into us from the first day of service. Patience was obedience stretched across time. Patience was trust in systems too large for any single mind to grasp. If the ledger said we were missing, then the ledger would eventually correct itself. Ledgers did not lie, they only waited. Still, hunger began to speak. At first it was quiet, a dull pressure beneath the ribs, easily ignored. I focused on routine, roll call, labor shifts, maintenance drills conducted with tools already worn thin. But as the days passed, the hunger sharpened. It became a presence, a thing with edges. It crept into my thoughts, interrupting prayers, shortening my temper. I caught myself watching others as they ate their dwindling portions, noting the speed of their chewing, the way their hands shook. I hated myself for that. Such thoughts were selfish, undisciplined. The officers assured us everything was under control. Their words were precise, carefully chosen, clearly memorized. Supply realignment, temporary delay, full confidence in rectification. They repeated these phrases until they lost meaning, becoming sounds rather than language. I noticed the officers ate behind closed doors. Each morning, I reported for duty, my stomach tight and empty, my breath fogging in the cold air. I still believed then. Believed that somewhere, deep within the archives, a clerk would frown at a line of red text and correct it. Believed that a convoy would arrive, its engines roaring like salvation. Belief was easier than admitting the alternative. Because the alternative was this: that we existed only as long as the ledger said we did. That flesh and blood meant nothing without a line of ink to authorize its continuation. That we could starve quietly, obediently, and the Imperium would never notice the difference. I prayed harder after that thought entered my mind. I prayed to be patient. I prayed to be seen. I prayed that the red sigil would turn green before the hunger grew too loud to ignore, and somewhere, far above me, the ledger remained unchanged. If the first week without supplies was disbelief, the second was a slow education in what disbelief becomes when it is forced to eat itself. Time in the barracks did not pass in hours. It passed in queues and denials. It passed in the long, shuffling lines outside the ration hall, where men stood with their stamps held out like relics, as if the right angle, the right prayer, might coax recognition from a machine that had already judged us irrelevant. It passed in the clicking of the vox beads when another temporary delay bulletin was read out, every syllable flattened by static and indifference. It passed in the ache under my ribs that sharpened from a discomfort into a constant, deliberate pain, like a hand closing around my organs, squeezing in slow increments. The promised convoy became an object of conversation at first, then an object of superstition. 3 days, someone said on the first day. They'll be here in 3, 2 more shifts, another insisted, because he'd heard it from an orderly who'd heard it from an officer's attendant, and rumor was the only food still plentiful. On the 3rd day, when nothing arrived, the number changed without anyone acknowledging it. The convoy was always just over the horizon, always delayed by a bureaucratic stamp. A weather condition in the upper strata, a mechanical fault that would surely be corrected. We spoke about it as if speaking could summon it. The hive around us groaned as though it too were hungry. That is not metaphor. I heard the strain in the pipes as pressure dropped. The ventilation coughed, then slowed, its recycled air coming through in weak breaths that smelled of hot dust and sour metal. The lights dimmed again, lumen strips paling into a jaundiced half-glow. In the corridors, the floor vibrated less. The endless thrum of distant machinery, once a heartbeat that made sleep possible, stuttered and faltered like a dying animal. The first time I saw the water rationing notice, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughter was the only sound that wasn't a prayer or a curse. The notice was printed on stiff paper and nailed to the bulkhead with the kind of ceremony reserved for holy decrees. It informed us, in crisp, formal script, that due to resource prioritization, water allocations would be reduced by 1/3. It advised us to consume responsibly and to report any wasteful behavior to our superiors, as if thirst could be wasteful. The recycled water already tasted wrong, metallic, acidic, as though it had passed through too many filters and too many bodies before reaching us. Now, with the reduction, it became a ration measured in mouthfuls. I learned to hold it on my tongue and swallow slowly, as though I could convince my throat it was more than it was. I learned to rinse my mouth with it and spit, because swallowing felt too final, too selfish. My hands began to shake during work shifts. Not constantly, not yet, only when I tried to do something delicate, something that required fine control. Tighten a bolt, align a coupling, handle a data cable with the reverence demanded by tech priests who never had to starve on the same schedule as we did. The trembling was subtle at first, a minor inconvenience. Then it grew into a humiliation, visible to anyone watching. I kept my hands in my pockets when I could. I clenched them into fists until my nails left crescents in my palms. The protein bricks became dust. We had all eaten them for years. Compressed blocks of processed nutrient matter, stamped with production codes and expiration dates that had been irrelevant long before we were born. They were never pleasant, but they were dependable. You could break one in half and smell the faint chemical tang, the hint of old fat, and something like sawdust. You could chew and swallow and feel a small, blunt warmth in your belly, enough to keep the body working, enough to keep the mind obedient. Now we had leftovers of leftovers, brick fragments scraped from storage bins, powder gathered from the bottom of ration crates. We mixed it with water until it formed a paste that clung to the roof of the mouth like glue. When it dried, it tasted of nothing and everything: stale salt, rancid oil, disinfectant, and beneath it all, the faint sweetness of decay. I remember the sound most. Chewing used to be private. Now it was communal, a chorus of teeth grinding and tongues scraping. Men ate in silence, not out of discipline but out of shame. Every swallow was an accusation: I am still here, and you are not. I ate slowly, not from virtue but from fear that my portion would vanish too quickly and leave me with nothing to do but think. And thinking was dangerous. The officers continued their speeches. They stood on makeshift platforms in the main corridor, framed by banners that displayed motivational phrases and sacred sigils. Their uniforms were still pressed. Their boots still shone. That was the first thing that made my stomach turn. Not the hunger, not the cold, but the shine of their boots in a place where nothing else gleamed. They spoke of endurance, of duty, of the Emperor's gaze which was supposedly upon us always, even in forgotten corridors and unheated barracks. Their voices were steady, practiced. They told us we were being tested. They told us our faith would be rewarded. But their eyes betrayed them. I learned to watch their eyes, because the mouth can be trained to lie in beautiful, obedient shapes. The eyes cannot hide their constant calculations. When they spoke, their gaze flicked over us as if counting how many still standing, how many likely to collapse, how many could be pushed a little harder without breaking. They watched the empty corridors behind us, as if expecting someone to arrive and accuse them of failure. They were afraid of the absence, not of starvation. Not of us. Of the absence, the fact that the system had stopped sending answers. That was a terror officers did not know how to name, because it was not a foe you could shoot or a riot you could beat back with shock batons. It was a silence that swallowed authority. The rumors changed tone. At first, the convoy was delayed. Then it was attacked. Then it had never been dispatched at all. Someone swore they'd heard the convoy was rerouted to a front line elsewhere, and we were expected to make do. Someone else whispered that our designation had been blacklisted, that we had been marked for punishment because of a clerical infraction we didn't even know we'd committed. The most poisonous rumor was the simplest. The convoy came, but it went to the wrong place. It made sense. The Imperium was vast, and we were a small line in a data stack. A single digit misplaced could condemn thousands to starvation, and the ledger would record it as variance. When I heard that rumor, my throat tightened, not in fear, but in a strange, sick understanding. The idea of dying because someone typed the wrong number felt more in line with reality than any noble sacrifice. I began to count calories like prayers, not exact numbers. There was no way to know what a spoonful of protein paste truly contained, but approximate units. A mouthful, 3. I would tally them in my head as I ate, each swallow a bead on an invisible rosary. When I reached a certain count, I would stop. I told myself this was discipline, rationing. In truth, it was desperation dressed in ritual. The hunger made everything sharper, smells became vivid. The sour sweat of men too cold to wash. The chemical sting of disinfectant sprayed over communal latrines to mask the scent of sickness. The metallic tang of blood from cracked lips. Sounds too. I could hear the scrape of boots 2 corridors away, the clink of ration tins, the whisper of a man praying into his blanket at night, as if afraid the walls would report him for doubt. The body, deprived, becomes a sensor. It listens for survival. I had dreams of food that were not pleasant. Not feasts, not the impossible luxury of fresh meat or fruit. I dreamed of rations, clean bricks stamped with codes, water that didn't taste like rust. In the dream, I held them and could not eat because I was always interrupted. A voice would call my designation. A notice would be read. An officer would demand my attention. I would wake with my stomach gnawing itself, my mouth wet with saliva that had nowhere to go. On the 10th day without proper issue, a man collapsed in the corridor. He was not an old man. None of us were truly old. The Imperium does not give that gift freely. He was a worker from the maintenance detail, broad-shouldered, usually loud. He had been complaining that his limbs felt heavy, that his vision blurred. We all told him to keep moving. Movement meant warmth. Movement meant you were still part of the machine. He fell anyway, face first, with a sound like a sack of scrap hitting the floor. No one rushed to him at first. We looked, waiting for him to get up, waiting for the shame to kick him upright. When he didn't move, someone finally knelt beside him and lifted his head. His eyes were open but vacant, unfocused, as if he had already been reassigned to some other duty beyond our sight. The officer on watch took out a slate and began to record. That was the most telling part. Not the collapse, not the slow spreading stain of urine beneath the man's legs, the recording. The officer's stylus moved with brisk efficiency, as if documenting a machine failure, not a human body. Later the man's bunk was empty. His stamp was removed from the roster. His designation was spoken once, then never again. We learned from that. We learned not to fall where others could see, if we could help it. We learned to lean against bulkheads when dizziness came, to hide our shaking hands. We learned that weakness invited attention, and attention invited paperwork, and paperwork could erase you faster than starvation. The convoy did not arrive, yet each day, someone still asked about it, because hope, like hunger, was a reflex. It rises in you even when you know it will be denied. It is a habit the body clings to as long as it can. I remember standing by the loading bay one shift, staring at the sealed doors. They were massive, layered with ceramite and steel, stamped with purity seals that had yellowed with age. Beyond them lay the transit tunnels and the endless arteries of the hive. I pressed my palm against the cold metal and tried to imagine engines on the other side, the vibration of approaching transport, the distant rumble of salvation. All I felt was stillness, and the faint tremor of my own hunger. By the time we began to petition, hunger was no longer the loudest thing inside me. That honor belonged to understanding. Petitions were the Imperium's preferred language for despair. They gave suffering a shape that could be stamped, filed, and safely ignored. When survival became uncertain, paperwork multiplied, as if ink itself could substitute for sustenance. The first petition was drafted by an officer whose hands still did not shake. It was written in the approved format, every line aligned, every phrase lifted from regulation manuals older than the barracks themselves. We watched him compose it with a kind of reverence, as though we were witnessing a prayer being inscribed. I believed in that petition. It bore our designation, our location, our operational role, and a precise accounting of missed supply cycles. It cited protocols and subclauses, highlighted compliance, emphasized loyalty. It ended with the proper invocations. It was stamped, triple-checked, and transmitted upward through channels none of us had ever seen. We waited. Days passed, then weeks. The Vox remained silent except for routine broadcasts that had nothing to do with us. Reports from elsewhere spoke of victories, of glorious expenditures of lives and material. None of it touched us. We existed in a quiet pocket of neglect, sealed off by omission. The second petition was more urgent. It included biometric data, weight loss averages, productivity decline percentages, injury rates exacerbated by malnutrition. Numbers, always numbers. We learned that suffering needed to be quantified before it could be acknowledged. I watched men step onto the scales for recording, their ribs showing through thinning uniforms, their faces hollowed into unfamiliar shapes. The data was compiled, transmitted, and logged. Still nothing. The third petition was drafted with what the officers called appropriate escalation. It referenced the previous submissions, cited the lack of response as a procedural concern, and carefully avoided any language that could be interpreted as complaint. Complaint was dangerous. Complaint suggested dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction was the first step toward disloyalty. By then, the hunger had changed. It was no longer a sharp pain but a constant erosion. My thoughts slowed. Words slipped away from me mid-sentence. I would enter a room and forget why I was there, then stand still until someone shouted at me to move. My body began to consume itself. I could feel it in my thighs, in the way stares became a negotiation rather than a motion. When the reply finally came, it arrived without ceremony. A single transmission, routed through channels so old their machine, spirits complained audibly when accessed. It was months out of date, time-stamped long before the second petition had even been sent. The message praised our continued operational effectiveness and thanked us for our diligence in fulfilling assigned duties under challenging conditions. There was no mention of supplies, no acknowledgement of missing rations, no correction of the ledger, just praise, hollow, immaculate praise, preserved like a corpse in formaldehyde. I read the message 3 times, my eyes skimming over the words, as if they might rearrange themselves into something useful. They did not. Around me others did the same. Some laughed, some stared. One man tore the printout in half, and was immediately disciplined for damaging official correspondence. That was when something inside me broke, not loudly, not all at once, but with the quiet, final snap of a thread pulled too tight for too long. The system did not hate us. Hatred requires recognition. Hatred means you matter enough to be opposed. What we faced was worse absence. The ledger did not mark us as traitors, or failures, or even casualties. It simply did not see us at all. We were a blank space, a clerical shadow. And in that shadow we were free to die without causing inconvenience. I began to notice the banners. They hung in every major corridor, every work hall, every space where we gathered. Bright, clean, untouched by the grime that coated everything else. They bore inspirational phrases rendered in high script, praising sacrifice, endurance, and unquestioning service. I had walked past them for years without really seeing them. Now, as my vision narrowed from hunger, they loomed larger, their colors almost painful. Through suffering, purity, service is life. To endure is to be chosen. I watched men collapse beneath those words. I watched them kneel to pray beneath banners that promised reward through pain, their prayers sticking in dry throats. Compliance was still measured, attendance still taken. Even as bodies failed, devotion was recorded with meticulous care. We were still expected to meet quotas. When production numbers dipped, the response was not supplies but exhortation. Officers called emergency assemblies to remind us of our obligations. They spoke of duty as if it were nourishment, as if reciting the right words could fill an empty stomach. They quoted regulations and catechisms, their voices echoing in halls that smelled increasingly of sickness. I noticed then how often the word acceptable was used. Acceptable losses, acceptable delayance, acceptable variance. Our condition was framed as a deviation within tolerances, not a crisis. The ledger did not ask if we were starving. It asked whether our output remained within acceptable margins. As long as the answer was yes, nothing else mattered. And so we lied. Not overtly, not in ways that could be proven. We padded numbers. We reclassified failed shifts as maintenance. We spread losses across categories so no single metric spiked too sharply. We did this not out of rebellion, but out of habit. The Imperium taught us to survive by becoming complicit in our own erasure. Every lie bought us another day. I remember a man named, no, not his name, his designation. He worked beside me on the line, a quiet figure who never complained. One morning he did not report. His bunk was still made, his tools neatly arranged. An officer marked him absent, then present, then reassigned his designation to cover a gap elsewhere. By the end of the shift, it was as if he had never existed. No ceremony, no record of death, just an adjustment. That night, I lay awake listening to the soft, irregular breathing of those who remained. I realized then that the most efficient way to kill us was not through violence, but through procedure. Starvation was simply the method. Bureaucracy was the weapon. The hunger made me see patterns everywhere. In the way messages looped endlessly without resolution. In the way requests climbed hierarchies only to vanish into abstraction. In the way responsibility dissolved the higher it traveled. No single hand strangled us. 1,000 hands passed us along, each releasing their grip just enough to say it wasn't their fault. I began to fear the sound of the vox. Each crackle raised my heart. Each announcement brought a spike of anticipation that left me weaker when it faded into irrelevance. The system trained us to hope in controlled doses, like medication, enough to keep us compliant, not enough to inspire action. And still, we worked. We worked because stopping would have been an admission. We worked because the ledger still recorded output, and as long as it did, we were technically alive. We worked because the alternative was to sit still and feel our bodies shutting down piece by piece. I caught my reflection one cycle in a polished panel. It startled me. My face had changed. Cheeks hollow, eyes sunken, skin pulled tight as parchment. I looked older but not wiser, just reduced. I pressed my fingers to my collarbone and felt it protrude sharply, a landmark that had not been there before. I wondered how much of me could disappear before the ledger noticed. Probably all of it. That was the revelation hunger finally delivered, not that we were doomed, but that our doom was irrelevant. We could fade completely, and the system would continue untroubled, its ledgers clean, its procedures intact. The banners would still hang, the officers would still speak, the messages would still praise our continued effectiveness, long after there was no one left to read them. Understanding that did not make me angry. It made me tired. Order returned the moment it became clear that hunger alone would not keep us obedient. It arrived not with food or warmth, but with boots. The enforcers came down from the upper levels in disciplined pairs, their presence announced by the hard, deliberate cadence of their steps echoing through the corridors. The sound cut through the murmur of the barracks like a blade. We knew that rhythm. It was the sound of correction. The sound of rules being enforced after patience had expired. They wore heavier armor than our officers, their plates scarred and polished in equal measure, bearing the marks of long service against things far worse than us. Their visors were dark, unreadable, their batons humming softly with restrained energy. Where the officers had spoken in phrases and platitudes, the enforcers spoke in commands, short and absolute. We were ordered to assemble. The main corridor filled slowly. Movement was painful now. Men rose from bunks with the care of the elderly, joints stiff, muscles wasted. Some leaned on the walls as they walked. Others were supported by comrades who could barely afford the strength to help. No one spoke. Hunger had taken our voices long before the enforcers arrived. An officer stood beside the lead enforcer, slate in hand. His uniform was immaculate, his face drawn tight with a seriousness that bordered on relief. At last, something tangible was happening. At last, authority had teeth again. Discipline has degraded, he announced. Compliance metrics have fallen outside acceptable variance. The words were flat, procedural. He might have been describing a machine fault. The enforcer stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The hum of his baton filled the silence like an insect trapped in the skull. Failure to maintain discipline, he said, constitutes dereliction of duty. A man was pulled from the line. I did not know him well. I knew his face, the way one knows furniture after years of passing it in the same corridor. He had been whispering too loudly the night before, speculating about the convoy, about abandonment. Someone had reported him, or perhaps the enforcers had simply selected him at random. The distinction no longer mattered. He did not resist. Resistance required energy. They dragged him to the center of the corridor and forced him to his knees. The officer read his designation, his assigned role, the infraction. Each word was recorded. Each syllable carried weight. The enforcer placed a gloved hand on the man's shoulder, steadying him as one might steady a tool before use. The baton cracked. The sound was sharp, final, not the drawn-out agony of punishment, but the efficient violence of execution. The man collapsed forward, his body convulsing once before going still. There was a smell then, burned hair, scorched fabric, something metallic that made my mouth water in a way that sickened me. Silence followed. Let this be recorded. The officer said, his voice only slightly unsteady, that order has been restored. The body was not removed immediately. It lay there as we were dismissed, a lesson in flesh and bone. I stepped around it on my way back to my bunk, careful not to look too closely at the face. The eyes were open, staring at nothing. I wondered, briefly, if he had been hungry when he died. Then I hated myself for wondering. The executions became regular after that. Not daily, not at first. The Imperium preferred escalation to be measured. Too much violence too quickly risked chaos. Instead, the enforcers appeared whenever whispers grew too bold, whenever movement slowed too visibly, whenever desperation threatened to become collective rather than private. Each execution was public. Each was documented. What happened afterward was worse. The bodies were not wasted. We were informed, via a posted notice, that due to resource scarcity, all organic material would be recycled in accordance with emergency sustenance protocols. The wording was clinical, almost polite. There was a stamp at the bottom, authenticating it beyond question. I did not see the processing itself. That mercy was afforded to us, but I smelled it. The air near the lower levels changed, carrying a greasy, sweet odor that clung to the back of the throat. The protein paste altered in texture, becoming slightly thicker, slightly warmer. No one commented on it. We ate in silence, eyes downcast, chewing carefully. I felt relief the first time I swallowed it. Not because it tasted better, it didn't, but because it filled me more than the dust had. My body responded immediately, greedily, drawing strength from whatever it was given. The relief was instinctive, animal. Then the shame arrived. It crept in slowly, winding itself around the relief until the two became inseparable. I realized what I was eating. Realized that survival had crossed a line I had sworn, silently, never to approach. I told myself it was sanctioned, authorized. The Imperium had decreed it acceptable, and therefore it was acceptable. That logic tasted as foul as the paste. Survival became transactional. Every day I calculated risks. Speak or stay silent. Help a faltering comrade or preserve my own strength. Report a whisper or pretend not to hear it. Each decision carried weight now, because the consequences were no longer abstract. They lay in the corridor afterward, cooling slowly, waiting to be processed. Trust dissolved. Men stopped sleeping deeply. Conversations dwindled to nods and gestures. We learned to read each other's faces not for camaraderie but for threat. Who was watching? Who was listening? Who might trade your designation for an extra half portion, or simply to avoid scrutiny? I hated myself most for understanding why they might. The enforcers did not enjoy their work. I could see that in the way they avoided looking at us unless necessary, in the efficiency with which they moved. To them, we were not enemies. We were a system drifting out of alignment, and they were the corrective force. Pain was just a tool. One of them caught my eye once as I passed. For a fraction of a second, his visor tilted, and I felt seen, not as a number, but as a person. The moment passed immediately, replaced by rigid posture and procedural detachment. Whatever he had felt, it was irrelevant. Sympathy was not part of his mandate. The officers' speeches changed tone after that. No more talk of patience. No more reassurances about delays. Now the focus was obedience, endurance reframed as submission. He spoke of unity, of rooting out weakness, of the danger of dissent during challenging operational periods. Each speech ended with a reminder discipline ensured survival. I understood then what survival meant. Not safety, not relief, simply the postponement of death for those willing to comply completely. Survival was no longer about living, it was about not being selected next. The walls seemed closer after that, not physically, but perceptually. Corridors felt narrower, ceilings lower. The hive pressed in on us, its weight constant and uncaring. Even the air felt monitored, as if each breath was being tallied against some unseen quota. At night, I lay awake listening for footsteps. The hum of a baton in the distance became a sound I could not unhear. Even when it was not there, my mind supplied it. A phantom vibration that kept me alert and afraid. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of corridors filled with bodies, of ledgers written in blood. I stopped praying for supplies. I prayed instead to be overlooked, because by then, I knew the truth we had all circled without naming order would be maintained, no matter the cost. If starvation did not kill us efficiently enough, discipline would finish the work. The Imperium would not allow disorder, even in a forgotten corner. Even among those it had already decided did not matter. We were being consumed to preserve the illusion of control. And I was still alive, which meant I was complicit. When the food ran thin again, faith arrived to take its place. It was not announced as a replacement, of course. Nothing so crude. Faith was presented as reinforcement, a supplement to failing bodies and fraying minds. The notice appeared on the barracks doors at the beginning of a new cycle, printed on parchment instead of slate, its edges stamped with devotional seals. Attendance at the shrine hall was no longer encouraged. It was mandatory. The first service was held at what used to be a storage concourse, hastily converted into a place of worship. The crates were gone, their contents long consumed or repurposed, and in their place stood rows of benches welded from scrap. Incense burners hung from chains bolted into the ceiling, filling the air with thick, cloying smoke that stung the eyes and coated the tongue. I smelled sanctified oils mixed with mold and rust. It was overwhelming, intentional. We were herded in slowly, bodies brushing against one another, each step an effort. The cold followed us inside, clinging to our bones even as the incense made us sweat beneath our thinning uniforms. At the front of the hall stood the shrine itself, a towering assembly of metal plates, devotional icons, and flickering candles arranged around a central reliquary whose contents were never explained. They did not need to be. Mystery was part of the ritual. The priest began to speak. His voice was strong, resonant, amplified by hidden vox emitters. He wore robes layered thickly, their fabric heavy with embroidery and purity seals. He looked well fed. That detail lodged in my mind like a shard of glass, painful and impossible to ignore. Blessed are the enduring, he intoned, spreading his arms wide. For through suffering we are made worthy. We knelt. The floor was cold metal, unpadded, unforgiving. Kneeling sent a spike of pain through my knees and up my spine, but I welcomed it. Pain was familiar. Pain made sense. Hunger was more insidious. It whispered, negotiated, begged. Pain simply existed. The prayers were long. They were structured in call and response, forcing participation even from those whose voices had grown weak. When someone failed to answer loudly enough, the priest paused, his gaze sweeping the hall until the response was repeated with sufficient fervor. Faith, like everything else, was measured. I felt my thoughts slow as the service dragged on. My stomach cramped, sharp and hollow, reacting to the incense as if it were food. Saliva pooled in my mouth. My hands trembled where they rested on my thighs, fingers numb and tingling. The priest spoke of trials. He spoke of ancient sieges and righteous deprivation, of saints who starved gladly to prove their devotion. He told us that suffering was not a sign of abandonment, but of attention, that to be tested was to be valued, that those who broke beneath the weight of hunger had revealed a flaw that would have doomed them eventually anyway. I wanted to believe him. Belief would have been easier than doubt. Doubt required energy I no longer had. As he spoke, I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest, not physical warmth, but something like emotional relief. The idea that this had purpose, that our pain was meaningful, was intoxicating. I clung to it like a ration. Services became daily, then twice daily. Work schedules were adjusted to accommodate prayer cycles. Meals, what few there were delayed or shortened in favor of extended worship. The logic was clear: nourishment of the soul would sustain the body. Those who complained were reminded that the faithful endured far worse in ages past. Their complaints were recorded, flagged as indicators of spiritual weakness. Confession booths appeared along the walls, crude partitions with mesh screens, staffed by junior clerics who listened silently as men whispered their doubts, their fears, their hunger-fueled thoughts of disobedience. I went once. I confessed that I resented the priest, that I envied his robes, that I sometimes dreamed of stealing food from the dead. The cleric assigned me additional prayers, no absolution, just more words to recite. My body continued to fail. Standing from kneeling became a negotiation. My vision darkened at the edges when I rose too quickly. During one service, I felt myself swaying, the shrine blurring before me. I focused on the candles. On the way, wax dripped slowly down their sides, thick and golden. I imagined eating it. The thought horrified me, and then it didn't. The priest noticed collapses now. When someone fell during prayer, it was framed as a test. The fallen were dragged gently to the side, their condition assessed. If they could stand again, they were praised for perseverance. If they could not, they were carried away and did not return. The priest spoke of them as having been called to higher service. We all knew what that meant. Faith became currency. Those who displayed fervor, who sang loudly, knelt longest, wept openly, were noticed. They were sometimes rewarded with small privileges, a warmer sleeping assignment, lighter duty, a half measure of additional sustenance, disguised as sacramental offering. I watched this happen and felt something ugly twist inside me. I tried to pray harder. I knelt longer, ignoring the pain until my legs went numb. I mouthed the words until my lips cracked and bled. I forced tears that came too easily, my body already weakened and emotional. I hated myself for it, but hatred required less energy than hunger. Hope became regulated. The priest warned us against false expectations. He told us that to hope for material relief was to misunderstand the nature of our trial. True hope lay in acceptance, in surrender, in embracing the possibility that our reward would come only after death. That was when I realized what faith had become here. It was not a promise of salvation. It was an anesthetic, a way to dull the pain enough that we would stop struggling. Faith did not fill our stomachs. It filled the space where resistance might have formed. I watched men fade, not die, not yet, but withdraw. They stopped speaking outside of prayer. Their eyes lost focus, turning inward. They became lighter somehow, as if already halfway gone. When they were finally carried away, it felt less like a loss and more like an administrative update. I began to envy them. The hunger had changed again by then. It was no longer sharp or constant. It had become distant, muffled, like a sound heard through thick walls. My body felt hollow, but the ache was muted. That frightened me more than pain ever had. Pain meant awareness. Numbness meant surrender. During one service, as the priest spoke of transcendence through deprivation, I felt my hands shaking violently. Not from cold, not from hunger, but from something like anger struggling to surface. I clenched them until my nails broke skin. Blood welled, warm and real. I focused on that sensation. For a moment, it anchored me. Reminded me I was still flesh. Still present. Still capable of feeling something that was not sanctioned. Then the moment passed. The incense thickened. The prayers continued. The banners overhead promised purity through suffering, and I found myself repeating the words automatically, without meaning, without resistance. Faith had not saved us. It had consumed what little of us remained, digesting doubt and leaving behind obedience. And as my body thinned and my thoughts slowed, I understood the terrible efficiency of it. You do not need chains when belief will hold the prisoner still. The machines began to die before we did. At first, it was subtle enough to deny. A hesitation in a conveyor's rhythm. A pause between piston cycles that lingered a fraction of a second too long. The manufactorum had always been old. Older than the barracks, older than any of us, and its groans and shrieks were as familiar as breathing. But now those sounds changed. They lost confidence. Where once there had been relentless motion, there was now effort. Effort requires fuel. We were assigned to compensate. That was the wording used in the work orders. Manual compensation for mechanical inefficiency. It sounded technical, reasonable. In practice, it meant we became replacement parts for failing machines. Where automated loaders stalled, we hauled crates by hand. Where cutting arms lost precision, we guided the tools ourselves, fingers perilously close to blades dulled by overuse. Where power fluctuations interrupted cycles, we reset systems again and again until our heads rang with the effort. The air in the manufactorum thickened. Without proper maintenance supplies, filters clogged and vents slowed. Heat pooled in pockets near functioning furnaces, while other sections fell into frigid stillness. The smell was constant and layered burned insulation, hot oil, unwashed bodies, blood from reopened wounds that refused to heal. Every breath felt like an act of defiance. Machines failed one by one. Each failure was logged. I watched a servo press seize mid-cycle, its pistons locking with a scream of tortured metal. Sparks showered the floor, scattering like fireflies before fading into smoke. The tech adept assigned to the sector arrived late, his augmetic limbs clicking softly as he circled the machine. He performed the rites of appeasement, intoning binaric prayers, anointing joints with oil stretched too thin to be effective. The machine did not respond. The adept sighed, a human sound, surprisingly wary, and marked the unit as temporarily inactive. The designation was meaningless. There were no replacement parts coming. Temporarily had lost its meaning weeks ago. We stripped it anyway. Bolts, cables, pistons, anything that could be repurposed was removed under the adept's supervision. I held parts still warm from friction, my palms blistering beneath my gloves. Each piece was catalogued, reassigned, bolted onto another machine that might last one more cycle because of it. We were cannibalizing the manufactorum to sustain the illusion of productivity. Quotas did not change. That was the most oppressive part. Despite failing machinery and failing bodies, the expected output remained fixed. Adjustments were made on paper, extended shifts, revised efficiency calculations, but the final numbers stayed the same. The ledger demanded consistency. Even if reality could no longer provide it, men collapsed on the floor more often now. Not dramatically. Not with cries. They simply sat down and did not get up again. Their bodies, pushed beyond what starvation would normally allow, reached a quiet limit and stopped. Enforcers were slower to respond here. The manufactorum was loud, chaotic, and the deaths blended into the background noise. When someone fell into a machine, that was recorded as an accident. I saw it happen once. A man beside me. Designation etched into my memory because I saw it on his badge as he fell, stumbled while guiding a heavy assembly into place. His arms lacked the strength to correct the imbalance. The assembly tipped. He went with it, dragged forward into the machinery's teeth. There was a sound, wet and final, followed by a spray that dotted my face and chest. The machine stalled. We shut it down. We cleaned the area. The remains were collected for recycling. The downtime was logged as a minor inefficiency. I scrubbed my face afterward with recycled water until my skin burned. The smell stayed. Decisions became unbearable. Each day we chose which machines to keep alive, which lines to abandon, which failures to hide. We pulled parts from units that could have served us later to meet today's quota. We borrowed time from tomorrow, knowing tomorrow would demand payment with interest. I felt it in my chest constantly, a pressure that had nothing to do with hunger or cold. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, because I knew that every choice hastened the end. But there was no alternative. To refuse was to invite immediate punishment. To comply was to stretch the dying process just long enough to satisfy the ledger. Productivity reports remained optimistic. I saw one posted on a notice board near the overseer's station. Clean lines, rising graphs. A bold statement declaring our sector operationally stable despite challenges. I stared at it for a long time, my vision swimming. Behind me, a body lay covered with a sheet, waiting to be moved. The report did not mention him. The manufacturum's silence came in stages. First, the smaller machines went quiet. Auxiliary lines shut down, their purpose deemed non-essential. Then entire sections were powered down to conserve energy, plunging work areas into darkness broken only by emergency lumens. The remaining machines labored harder, their remaining parts stressed beyond design limits. Finally, a main line failed. The sound was immense, a cascading series of impacts and ruptures that echoed through the structure like thunder. The floor shook. Overhead cranes lurched to a halt, their loads swaying dangerously. Alarms wailed, then cut off abruptly when power failed. For a moment, there was nothing but breathing, labored, panicked breathing in the dark. Emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a sickly red glow. Faces looked like skulls in that light, eyes too large, cheeks too hollow. The overseer shouted orders that no one had the strength to follow quickly. When the dust settled, the verdict was clear. The line was dead, too many critical failures. Too much damage. Repair would require parts and manpower we did not have. The tech adepts performed their assessments, their augmetics whirring softly as they interfaced with dead systems. Their conclusion was unanimous. Decommissioned. The word echoed in my head. Decommissioned machines were stripped, logged, and forgotten. Their purpose ended. Their materials redistributed until nothing remained but empty space and outdated records. I understood then that we were not far behind. The silence spread. Each shutdown reduced the ambient noise of the hive, creating pockets of unnatural quiet. Without the constant mechanical roar, other sounds intruded: coughing, retching, whispered prayers, the scrape of boots on metal. The hive felt hollow, as if its heart were failing, and the blood no longer reached its extremities. Work continued in the remaining sections, but it felt performative now, a gesture of obedience rather than a meaningful act. We went through the motions, recorded outputs that barely justified the effort, and watched as the manufactorum slowly suffocated. I leaned against a cold bulkhead during a break that was not officially sanctioned and felt my heart racing despite my exhaustion. Each beat was erratic, desperate. My hands were numb. My thoughts came slowly, as if wading through thick fluid. I wondered how many machines had to fail before the ledger noticed. How many bodies? The answer, I suspected, was more than we had left to give. The manufactorum fell silent not all at once, but in surrender. Each shutdown was an admission that the system could no longer sustain itself, even through cannibalization. And as the last line powered down, its final report transmitted automatically, optimistic phrasing and all, I felt a strange certainty settle over me. We had crossed a threshold. Without the machines, we were no longer useful. Without usefulness, our survival was no longer even theoretically justified. The ledger would not rage or protest. It would simply adjust. And when it did, it would be precise. The notice appeared without ceremony, as all true sentences do. It was posted on the main data board outside what remained of the overseer's office, its presence announced not by alarm, but by silence. Conversation stalled when people noticed it. Movement slowed. Even the enforcers lingered nearby, their posture rigid, as if guarding something sacred. The slate glowed a sterile white, its text crisp and perfectly aligned. I remember thinking absurdly that it was beautifully formatted. I stepped closer with the others, squinting to focus my failing eyes. Hunger had blurred my vision, made distance uncertain. Words swam until I forced them to stay still. When they did, I understood immediately why no one spoke. Our designation was there, not crossed out, not simply amended. STTSUPD, UN Rakilas CFE. None, SOURCELOKUN Rediretiated, ATT Radio and RAT AACPDAL. That last line was the heaviest, acceptable. The word carried the weight of absolution, not for us, but for those who had decided this. Acceptable meant no further action required. Acceptable meant our deaths would not trigger audits or inquiries. Acceptable meant the system had finished considering us. I felt a strange calm reading it, not relief, not despair, clarity. For weeks, months, perhaps, we had existed in uncertainty, trapped between hope and hunger, discipline and faith. Now there was an answer. No more waiting for convoys that would never come. No more petitions climbing empty hierarchies. No more pretending this was temporary. We were surplus. I laughed then, a short, broken sound that startled even me. It drew looks from the enforcers, but none stepped forward. Laughter, I realized, was no longer a threat. Non-essential units did not need correction. They needed processing. The officer who had once spoken of patience stood beneath the slate, hands clasped behind his back. His face was pale, drawn tight as parchment. He did not meet our eyes. Assignments will be updated accordingly, he said. Those capable of continued labor will be reassigned to hazard details. He hesitated, the pause brief but noticeable. Will be documented. Documented, not treated. Not assisted. Documented. The reassignment lists followed quickly. Names, designations scrolled across secondary slates, grouping us by remaining utility. I watched mine appear under salvage and containment, a category reserved for tasks with high mortality and low oversight. Others were assigned to tunnel clearing, waste reclamation, structural collapse assessment, jobs that existed solely because no machine remained to perform them. Some designations appeared under no heading at all. Those individuals were escorted away later, quietly, efficiently. No explanation was given. None was needed. Hazard duty began immediately. There was no time for preparation. No rations issued. No blessings beyond a cursory sign of the Aquila traced in the air by a junior cleric who looked away as he did it. We were handed equipment scavenged from closed sections, breathers with cracked seals, harnesses frayed thin, lamps that flickered uncertainly. I was sent into the lower tunnels. They lay beneath the manufactorum, a web of maintenance shafts and waste channels that had been neglected even when resources were plentiful. Now they were unstable, partially flooded, choked with debris. My task was to assess structural integrity and recover anything deemed salvageable. It was dark down there, not the honest darkness of night, but the layered gloom of a place never meant to be seen by human eyes. My lamp cast a weak cone of light that barely penetrated the dust-filled air. Every step stirred clouds that made my lungs burn. The walls sweated with chemical residue and old moisture, slick beneath my gloved hands. I worked slowly, methodically, not because I was careful, but because my body no longer moved quickly. Each motion required negotiation. Each breath rasped in my chest like sandpaper. I recorded measurements on my slate, marking cracks and shifts that would never be repaired. The tunnel groaned around me. I felt vibrations through my boots, distant collapses echoing like thunder muffled by earth and metal. Somewhere above, another section was failing. I wondered if it would reach me. I wondered if I cared. Others died on hazard duty. Sometimes we heard it, a scream cut short, a rumble followed by silence. Sometimes we didn't. The reports came back later, impersonal and neat. Worker failed to return. Structural compromise encountered. Loss within acceptable parameters. Acceptable again. I saw a man I recognized once, emerging from a tunnel coughing blood, his eyes wild. He tried to speak, to warn us about something shifting deeper inside. An enforcer caught him before he could finish, checked his designation, and shook his head. Non-essential, he said quietly, almost apologetically. The man was escorted away. I never learned what he had seen. My body grew lighter, not metaphorically, physically. My uniform hung loose, belts needing extra notches that no longer existed. My cheeks were hollow enough that my teeth showed when I did not intend them to. My thoughts came slowly, each one requiring effort to summon and hold. But the fear was gone. Fear requires uncertainty. It needs the possibility of escape, of reprieve. Now that the decision had been made, there was nothing left to fear. The ledger had spoken. We were already dead in every way that mattered. Our bodies were just catching up. I began to notice small details again. The way dust settled on my boots in the tunnels. The faint echo of my breathing inside the breather mask. The warmth of my own blood when I scraped my arm on exposed metal. These sensations felt sharp, vivid, almost precious. With the future erased, the present expanded to fill everything. I understood then why some men had seemed calm when reassigned. Clarity is a kind of mercy. On my last assignment, I was ordered to assist with a containment seal near an abandoned power conduit. The area was unstable, radiation levels elevated. The risk was extreme. The slate did not bother to hide it. I acknowledged the order without hesitation. The conduit chamber was vast and empty, its machinery long stripped, its walls scorched and cracked. Warning sigils peeled from the bulkheads, their colors faded. My lamp flickered as I moved deeper inside. Each step echoed, lonely and final. I placed the seal as instructed, hands steady despite the tremor that never quite left them. When I finished, I leaned against the wall and rested there, longer than regulations allowed. No one called me back. No one checked. I thought about the ledger, about the moment our designation had changed, about how many lives were erased by similar updates every day across the Imperium, quietly, efficiently. I realized then that this was not failure. This was optimization. The Imperium did not mourn us because mourning was inefficient. I closed my eyes and breathed in the stale, contaminated air. It burned, but I welcomed it. My chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately. Each breath felt like a choice, and I knew the choices were nearly over, above me, somewhere. The system continued. Below me the earth waited. I am writing this because the slate still accepts my input. That is the only reason. My hands barely recognize themselves anymore. The fingers are thin, the joints swollen and stiff, skin stretched tight and pale as cured hide. When I press the stylus down, there is a delay, thought to muscle, muscle to motion. The slate registers my biometrics with a faint chime each time I touch it, as if reminding me that I am still, technically, alive. I do not know how much time has passed since the reclassification. Time has lost its edges. Without shifts, without meaningful work, cycles blur together into a long, grey continuum of hunger and fatigue. The hazard assignments dwindled as there were fewer of us capable of walking into danger. Those who remained were rotated less frequently, not out of mercy, but because rotation implied planning. Planning was no longer required. I was moved to a holding sector near the lower barracks. What remained of them? The heat never came back. The lights stayed dim. The air was still. Bodies were laid out behind temporary partitions when they failed, their designations logged, their remains collected when convenient. Sometimes that took days, sometimes longer. The smell became part of everything. At first it was sharp, decay, waste, unwashed flesh. Later, it softened into something sweet and dull, a background presence that no longer triggered revulsion. I realized then that my senses were retreating, conserving themselves like the rest of me. The hunger is different now. It is no longer pain. Pain requires resistance. Hunger now is a vast, quiet emptiness that fills me completely. My stomach no longer cramps. It barely signals at all. Instead, there is a weakness so total it feels like calm. My body has accepted the terms. I think that is what frightens me most. I try to remember what food felt like. Not taste, that is too abstract, but wait. The sense of something settling inside me, grounding me to the world. I cannot recall it clearly. Memory fades when it is not reinforced, and there has been nothing to reinforce that memory for a long time. Water still comes, irregularly, enough to keep organs functioning just past the threshold of usefulness. I sip it slowly, not because I want to savor it, but because swallowing too quickly makes me dizzy. Sometimes my hands shake so badly that I spill it, watching droplets vanish into the floor grating. I no longer feel anger when that happens, only a vague disappointment, like misplacing an object I will not need much longer. The priest stopped visiting this sector. Faith has its limits. It requires an audience capable of responding, capable of kneeling, capable of repeating the words. We are past that now. Those who still murmur prayers do so out of habit, not belief. The words fall from their mouths and vanish unrecorded. I think the Imperium prefers it that way. There is a terminal mounted on the wall opposite my bunk. It cycles through status updates automatically. I watch it when I cannot sleep, which is often. The screen lists metrics and summaries, all rendered in calm, neutral tones. Eritio anaviagene expetid perimeter s, rci rebutio and cum pmsttr stust. Stab stable. I wonder what that word would mean to someone who had never been here. To someone whose world was still loud with machines and voices and purpose. Stability here is silence. Stability is the absence of complaint. Stability is a room full of bodies too weak to disrupt anything. My own designation appears briefly in the cycle, tagged with a status marker, a COV, low do PROI. Low priority means no intervention is planned. I am comforted by that. Intervention implies attention, and attention implies correction. Correction would require energy from others, and the Imperium does not waste energy on what it has already written off. Sometimes I think about the ledger, not as a physical object, but as an idea, a vast, impossible record stretching across worlds and centuries, tracking lives like inventory. I imagine my designation moving through it, downgraded, reclassified, finally archived. I imagine the moment it will be marked complete. I wonder if there will be a sound. Probably not. Systems like that do not announce success. They simply proceed to the next task. My body feels light, not weak, light. As if parts of me are already gone, shed quietly without ceremony. When I lie back on the bunk, I barely feel the mattress beneath me. When I breathe, my chest rises shallowly, reluctantly, as if even my lungs are tired of the effort. There is a peace in that. Not the peace promised by faith or duty, but the peace of inevitability. The struggle is over. The outcome decided. All that remains is compliance. I am compliant. I no longer try to stand unless instructed. I no longer conserve strength for a future that will not arrive. I use what little energy I have to finish this record, because the slate still accepts it, and because documentation feels like the last ritual left to me. If someone reads this, and I doubt they will, it will not be because they care. It will be because the file was flagged or misfiled, or included in a data sweep centuries from now. Some clerk will skim it, extract a statistic, and move on. That is enough. The hunger has receded almost entirely now. In its place is a dull ache everywhere, like pressure from within my bones. My vision dims at the edges when I focus too long. The letters on the slate blur, but I force myself to continue, adjusting the angle until they sharpen again. I want the ledger to have something complete, not a complaint, not an accusation, just a record. I served, I waited, I endured, I was found non-essential, and I accepted that judgment. I did not riot. I did not disrupt output beyond acceptable variance. I did not require correction beyond what was efficient. I disappeared as instructed. Somewhere, a system will mark this as orderly, efficient, compliant. My fingers are slowing. The slate's surface is cool beneath my palm. I feel the faint chime again as it registers my vitals, weaker now, fading toward whatever threshold triggers closure. That will be the last update. I am content with that. The Imperium will continue. The hive will reroute power. The ledger will balance. And I will be reduced to a line item resolved. My end filed cleanly among millions of others. This is not tragedy. This is process. And I have fulfilled my duty by vanishing without complaint.